Mhm.
Meeting is being recorded.
All right, everybody, welcome back. We're here with our weekly chat with author Kevin McAleer about all kinds of literature. We're now covering all the novels of Raymond Chandler. We've done the first 5, and this is our 6th one. Kevin, please list in order the novels, the first 5 novels that we've done here.
The Big Sleep, 1939. Farewell, My Lovely, 1940. The High Window, 1942. The Lady in the Lake, 1943. The Little Sister, 1949. And now The Long Goodbye, 1953.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And I know you've read these more than once on your own end there. This is my first time, but I'm wondering what you thought of The Long Goodbye, reading it again this time around.
All right. So I'm going to be iconoclast and a naysayer, and I didn't care for it that much in comparison to the others. Why? Because, let me try to ground my reasoning at a very basic level. Chandler was classically educated at Dulwich College, just outside of London proper, his formative years as a young man. And he always would cite that education as having not only been formative for his prose style, having been a scholar of Greek and Latin, but his character. And not only his character, but his fictional character, Philip Marlowe, a man with a code of honor, this notion of chivalry, idealism. And I'm going back to that because I think Chandler lost a little bit of his classical education in this one. Again, why? Well, Matthew Arnold, anyone who's had any exposure to English literature of the past 200 or so years will know the name. A great poet, maybe his most famous work is Dover Beach. He was a great classicist. And he felt that the greatest work ever written was, can anyone guess? The Iliad. All right. Second place, I guess he would say the Odyssey. I don't know, but I remember him having mentioned that in some context, that the Iliad is the greatest novel ever written, greatest literary work. And what did he admire about Homer? I think, yeah, he broadened it out to Homer in general. So Homer's 2 great works, the Iliad and the Odyssey. What did he admire about him from a stylistic point of view? He admired 4 things: that he was simple, that he was direct, that there was a great nobility in his rendering of the characters who themselves were noble. And here's the 4th point, and it's the important one. It's the relevant one to my criticism of The Long Goodbye. The 4th quality that he admired greatly in Homer was the rapidity of his narrative. He said that. The simplicity, the directness, the nobility, and the rapidity. And if you think about Homer, it's rapid. I mean, he doesn't get involved too much. I mean, he does indeed. I mean, in a way, with, Achilles moping in his tent, right? However, the prose is really, it's fast paced, especially the battle scenes. And then we go to the Odyssey. It's the same thing, from one adventure to the next, just hand over fist, keeps you on the edge of your seat. I think Chandler lost that that fourth quality of the greatest classicist, arguably, Homer, which he was certainly inculcated with in his public school education at Dulwich College. He lost that. It's slow going, this novel, in comparison to the previous 5 already mentioned. It's his first novel, at least in my copy of it, that goes over 300 pages. All his others are like 220 to 60 max. I think that was The Little Sister. And that's indicative of my problem with the novel as a whole. It's slow going. It doesn't have that brisk pacing that I so admire in The Big Sleep and Farewell, My Lovely, especially, right? From one adventure to the next, but a coherent narrative. He hardly gives you time to catch your breath. Here, he gives you much too much time to catch your breath. You get a little bit bored, at least I did, okay? Which is saying a lot about my most admired American author. It had been a long time since I'd come back to this novel. And I know why now, because I don't really care for it in comparison to the others. Now, I love Chandler's prose, come what may. He can do no wrong, but he can do it a little bit more quickly. Do you mind, Raymond? And in this one, he just slowed the pace down. And if I can just continue 1 or 2 more minutes on this, and then I'll get to my other point about what I didn't much care about the novel. He knew this. He knew this himself. And here I will quote, like a good scholar citing my sources, in a letter that he sent along with the manuscript in 1952 to his literary agents. What were their names? Brandt and Brandt was the name of the literary agency. And he wrote a letter to a woman named Bernice Baumgarten. It was Karl Brandt, head of the agency, then Bernice Baumgarten, his right-hand woman, I suppose. And Chandler had developed a very close relationship to these two people over the years, as one sometimes does with one's agent. And accompanying the manuscript, he sent this letter, and it'll just be about a minute. And he wrote, "You may find it slow going." So I kind of stole his line there, I suppose. "It has been clear to me for some time that what is largely boring about mystery stories, at least on a literate plane, is that the characters get lost about a third of the way through. Often the opening, the mise en scène, the establishment of the background is very good. Then the plot thickens and the people become mere names. Well, what can you do to avoid this? You can write constant action, and that is fine if you really enjoy it." So this is the Cap, what's his name? The fellow who was the editor of Black Mask. Anyway, his dictum that you just keep the action moving, right? And when in doubt, send a guy through the door with a gun in his hand. Well, what you can do to avoid this, you can write constant action, and that is fine if you really enjoy it. But alas, one grows up, one becomes complicated and unsure, one becomes interested in moral dilemmas rather than who cracked who on the head. And at that point, perhaps, one should retire and leave the field to younger and more simple men. I don't necessarily mean writers of comic books like Mickey Spillane. He despised Mickey Spillane. Anyhow, I wrote this as I wanted to because I can do that now. I didn't care whether the mystery was fairly obvious, but I cared about the people, about this strange, corrupt world we live in, and how any man who tried to be honest looks in the end either sentimental or plain foolish. Enough of that. There are more practical reasons. You write in a style that has been imitated, even plagiarized, as at this point, 1952, many writers were doing. You write in a style that has been imitated, even plagiarized, to the point where you begin to look as if you were imitating your imitators. So you have to go where they can't follow. The danger is that the reader won't either. He was well aware of the danger here. And we have to give Raymond his due. He was a very self-aware writer. And I'm afraid that I wasn't quite able to follow him on this one. Okay? Which doesn't mean I give it a thumbs down. I give it a thumbs up. But in comparison to the others, it's in the 5 previous, it's in 6th place. So that's my opening statement.
Okay, what did the critics say about it?
Well, as you can imagine, all the academics, they just love it. He's pushing the form, you know, anything that gets long, you know, and loses a little bit of that simplicity and directness, which he also loses a little bit here, I would argue, just by virtue of it being so long and so sluggish in parts. But academics love that stuff, you know. They can analyze more. They can do more analysis of it, right? And it's not as plebeian, right? It's not, you know, action-packed and fast-paced, and you know, those are sort of, you know, ooh, for the hoi polloi. So the academics love it, and by them, anytime an academic starts to love, anytime the academic world starts to take something to its collective breast, beware, beware. And yeah, that's where we stand on this one here.
I read the Wikipedia entry. Did not Chandler say this was his best novel in his own opinion?
I think he wrote that somewhere, but he also said that Fairmont White Lovely is his best novel too. So, and he himself in his letters, I think one time at least, he wrote, "You can't ever believe what an author thinks about his own novels. He always has a skewed view of them." You know, so you can take it or leave it. I take the Fairmont White Lovely critique because that's still my favorite. Although I did say in our last video that the little sister has superseded it in this series of readings. So yeah, Farrell, my lovely little sister.
Do you want to walk us through some of the plot, just so we have a little background of that?
I can. Again, the caveat, it's a little bit tangled, but it's not as tangled as most, I don't think. I don't know if you found that, but let me try. The book, in essence, revolves around a friendship, or a would-be friendship. And this is a friendship between Philip Marlowe. Believe it or not, Marlowe gets a friend. That could be the title of it, you know, the subtitle. The Long Goodbye, or Marlowe Gets a Friend.
That's right.
Because in the previous books, he's been a complete lone wolf, right? Which is what I love about the character, right? So all of a sudden he's getting a friend. The whole concept of it doesn't appeal to me. He sees this guy on the first page. He's drunk, and his wife or ex-wife drives away in this expensive car, and he leaves the guy there, and Marlowe talks to him and takes him under his wing and drives him back home, sobers him up, and they talk, and Marlowe learns to like this guy. Okay, Marlowe's a do-gooder. He might have done something like that. But the fact that then they cultivate a friendship, and they don't cultivate a friendship right off the bat. There's a couple more instances where Marlowe sees him on the street drunk. And I think what appeals to Marlowe is how he can be polite and preserve a certain modicum of etiquette, even if he's blithering drunk. I think that's basically his appeal to Marlowe, because later on, as the story progresses, he says, you know, this fellow's name is Terry Lennox, by the way. He says, Terry, I think I preferred you drunk and on your uppers, because later on, Terry, he remarries a very rich heiress. This woman that Marlowe had seen drive away on the first page and leave him hanging, Terry, is his ex-wife. So in the course of the next 150 pages, Lennox gets back together with her. And he's sort of a kept man at that point. Little lapdog for this woman whose name is Sylvia Lennox, taken on Terry's name. She's known as Sylvia Lennox, this heiress. And at some point, Marlowe just loses respect for the guy, or he's sick of hearing the guy just tell him all his sob stories. And something has to be said about Terry Lennox. He's a war veteran, and apparently he was in the commandos, and he got half his face blown off, and he was captured by the Germans, and they had plastic surgeons who tried to put him together again. It's interesting. The Nazis would do that even. And they put him together again pretty good, but you could see where the operation had been. That's a real feature of this fellow, that he's kind of a half face, which is maybe symbolic. And the friendship breaks off, and at a certain point, then Marlowe gets a knock on his door, and it's Terry Lennox, and he's got a gun in his hand. And he tells Marlowe he's got to take him down to Tijuana. He puts the gun quickly away, but he wanted to kind of like make it so that Marlowe, if he had to tell a story to the cops later on, he could say that, well, he held a gun on me. I had no choice, that kind of thing, right? Without lying. And Marlowe doesn't want to know too much about it, but there's a murder that has occurred, apparently. And the murder is of Sylvia Lennox, of this wife of Terry Lennox. And Marlowe says, don't tell me anything. Don't really want to know, because if the cops question me, then I can just plead ignorance, that I'm not an accessory after the fact. So he drives Terry down to Tijuana, gets him safely across the border. Terry boards a plane. He's out of the country, out of the jurisdiction of the American and in particular the LA authorities. Well, as soon as Marlowe gets back, there's cops waiting for him. All right. What do you expect in a Marlowe novel, right? He's always going to have run-ins with the cops. And they hold him for 56 hours, actually, exactly. And they question him. They beat him up. And he doesn't come across with any information. He doesn't even tell them that he met with Terry and took him down to Tijuana. He clams up. And this is in all the papers. And shortly thereafter, he gets a phone call from some New York literary agent, a fellow by the name of Howard Spencer. And he says, Mr. Marlowe, yes, you were recommended to me, and I have a writer, and he's a problem. He's an alcoholic, and I need this 13th novel of his, whatever number, to, got to get it out there. He's a big seller for us, and we want this next novel, but it's taking forever. And now he's gone missing, and his wife doesn't know where he is. And, I guess this Spencer fellow in New York, he learned about Marlowe because he was in the papers in LA, got wind of it, thought this would be a good guy to, get on the case because he can keep his mouth shut. He can keep things confidential because he didn't spill any information about Terry Lennox. And so Marlowe, he meets up with the wife. She's beautiful. and he goes looking for this writer. He's got a couple. He's only got one lead, basically, that this writer might be at some drying out facility for alcoholics somewhere in LA or environs, and the doctor who is presiding over him, his case, his last name begins with V. And there's about 50, 60 pages spent on this, Marlowe looking for this doctor to find this writer. He finally does. That's kind of entertaining. Again, we have shady doctors again. That's a hallmark, you know. So tough, corrupt cops and shady doctors. That's a constant throughout the Marlowe novels. It's a lot of fun too. I like both those aspects. And you know, despite what I said at the top of the program about not much caring for the novel in comparison to the others, that's fun. That's nice. I actually like the first third of the book, and I'll tell you why I don't like the second third in comparison to that in a moment. He finds the guy finally, brings him back, and the fellow by the name is Roger Wade. Okay, his beautiful wife is Eileen Wade, and Eileen says, "Oh, that's wonderful, Mr. Marlowe, and you know, could you maybe stick around and play minder?" And Marlowe says, "Hey, I don't do that kind of thing. You know, you couldn't keep him from, you know, getting drunk and going off on a binge again, even if I were there, you know, all day and night. He'd find a way, and I can't be there all day and night." And okay, that's enough of that. And then one late night, he gets a phone call from Eileen Wade, and she says, "Okay, he's at it again. He's drunk. He's out there somewhere. I don't know exactly." And Marlowe gets in the car, and he drives out to a place called Idle Valley. That is the name of it, right? Idle Valley. Yes. And where is Idle Valley, Tim? Here's where you come in. I'm not exactly sure what the real life location of Idle Valley would have been.
You suggested in a previous talk that it might be the San Fernando Valley, but we know that's not true because he mentioned San Fernando Valley twice in here as a separate place.
Yes.
So, you know, that was a good guess because there's not many places called Valley in the LA basin. But it does say at one point that you picked up an ocean breeze in Idle Valley. Yeah. So it's close to the coastline.
And he goes out Ventura way. And I'm imagining it's the Conejo Valley.
Oh.
You know, because there's a lake there, the southern end of it. Because there's a lake there, and that could be Westlake, i.e. Westlake Village, or it could be Lake Sherwood, right? Those are the two kind of ritzy lakes. Thousand Oaks, where our sister and nephews live. Not the Thousand Oaks Chandler describes here, because it's very upper class, very hoity-toity. But somewhere around there, right? So not the San Fernando Valley, but not far away, because Marlowe can, you know, get there in like half an hour. Going like 65, get there in half an hour from his place in LA, right? So he gets there quick.
But you know, but it does have to be able to pick up an ocean breeze, and I'm not sure that Thousand Oaks gets that.
No.
I think that's a good guess.
Yeah.
I would hope it would be somewhere closer to the coastline.
Yeah, but he gets there in like half an hour. I was thinking about that. Good. We don't want to bore people with this, but we being locals, it's of interest to us where exactly this place might have been.
Yeah.
Anyway, he goes out to Idle Valley and he finds this Roger Wade. He's in the bushes somewhere, and he drags him into the house and he tries to sober him up. And later on, there's like a struggle for a gun. It goes off, and there's all kinds of oddball stuff that happens between Marlowe and Roger Wade and Eileen Wade in the course of the next 100 pages or so. And Marlowe does, in fact, sort of become his minder. He sort of, as he took upon this responsibility for Terry Lennox, this hapless drunk, he takes responsibility for another hapless drunk, this writer, Roger Wade. Marlowe seems to have a thing for hapless drunks. Anyway, what eventually happens is that Wade is killed somehow. We don't know. We don't know whether it's suicide or if it's maybe the houseboy, this fellow named Candy, who's Mexican, Chilean, we don't know exactly, but Latino. And or Eileen Wade, we don't know. As it turns out, it is Eileen Wade. She kills him. Now, why? What's the motivation? And it doesn't come as that great of a surprise that it was her as you're reading. And I had forgotten, sort of, because I hadn't read it in years, who had done it. But I was thinking Eileen Wade, actually, to tell you the truth. But Chandler says that himself. You know, the mystery is pretty clear. That's not the point of the novel. That's not the point of any of his novels, but particularly this one. And why did she do it? Well, it turns out that Roger Wade was having an affair with this Sylvia Lennox, this now dead wife of Terry Lennox, right, who had been murdered, and why he had gone across the border to escape the law, because he would have been the first suspect. And it turns out also we have a backstory that this Eileen Wade had been married to Terry Lennox. She had been married to Terry Lennox before he was Terry Lennox, and he was Paul Marston. That was his name as a soldier in the British Army. And she was over in Britain too. Now that I didn't understand, why this American woman apparently is over in Britain, maybe working as a nurse. I don't know, a whack. This is 1942, however, in November, in fact, when he gets this wound and is taken prisoner. They had married shortly before that, and he had changed his name because in the British Army, you're not allowed to marry, I guess, while you're enlisted or at that time or while you're being deployed. Anyway, he had changed his name for that reason. And then she had thought he had been lost. He'd only been captured, came back after the war, and they saw each other. They run across each other, as these coincidences sometimes will happen. But she's already married to this Roger Wade at this point, because she's a beautiful woman, right? So she's very she's a woman that men want to, you know, get close to and even marry. So she marries this rich, successful writer. And then in the meantime, Terry marries this Sylvia Lennox. So Terry obviously has a lot on the ball too. Two very attractive people, because he attracts this rich heiress, Sylvia Lennox. They marry. They end up in this community in Idle Valley, both these couples at a certain point. So that's how Roger is able to have this affair with Sylvia Lennox. And then Eileen gets wind of it, and then she realizes, well, this Sylvia Lennox, she has taken away two men in my life. I can't stand for this. I think that's good motivation. You know, if you're passionately in love with someone, apparently she was originally with this Roger Wade, and then most definitely with Terry, whom she lauds, whom she idolizes, actually. There's a passage where she talks about this tragic lost love of hers. It turns out that she has murdered Sylvia Lennox. Okay. And in the meantime, people have been trying to squelch this story. Two friends of Terry's whose lives he saved, and that's how he got the wound, and they are now active in Vegas. And then there's the father of Sylvia Lennox. He's really rich. His name is Harlan Potter. He's tried to put a lid on this whole thing, just doesn't want any publicity. As it turns out, what happens is, and Eileen Wade commits suicide shortly after it becomes clear that she has committed, because she admits it. And then she writes a suicide note, and she takes an overdose of something, Demerol, I think. The story comes to a conclusion. Marlowe's sitting in his office. He gets a knock on the door. There's this guy. He's a Mexican guy, Senor Mayoranes or something like that. He introduces himself. They talk a little bit about this and that. They're sitting across the desk from one another. And it turns out it's Terry Lennox. He'd gotten plastic surgery, again, but to look like a Mexican. They darkened his skin, and they'd taken bone out of his nose or cartilage to give it a more flattened appearance. I guess that makes you look like a Mexican. I don't know. But anyway, that's what is explained to us in the novel. And he has now come back to revisit the friendship with Marlowe. There are other details I left out. He writes a letter to Marlowe from Mexico, and then he's supposed to have committed suicide. See, it gets complicated, and I leave stuff out, and it doesn't make any sense to people. But apparently he was supposed to have been dead because he committed suicide, and he sent a letter to Marlowe, and he left a suicide note, and that's why everyone thought that the case was closed. Well, now he's back, and he wants to start up the friendship with Marlowe again, and Marlowe doesn't want to. He wants none of it. He says, "We're through. I liked you at the time, but this is just too much." And he felt that Terry had corrupted himself by going back to this Sylvia anyway. And then he has a couple gangster friends, or at least one named Mendy Menendez, with whom Marlowe has a couple ugly confrontations. And Marlowe says no. And it's a very famous ending. I can just read that. And this is the final goodbye. This stuff I like. This is great. Marlowe says, Chandler writes, he stood up. I stood up. He put out a lean hand. I shook it. So long, Senor Mayoranos. Nice to have known you, however briefly. So Terry Lennox has changed his identity completely, right? Goodbye, says Terry. He turned and walked across the floor and out. I watched the door close. I listened to his steps going away down the imitation marble corridor. After a while, they got faint, then they got silent. I kept on listening anyway. What for? Did I want him to stop suddenly and turn and come back and talk me out of the way I felt? Well, he didn't. That was the last I saw of him. I never saw any of them again, except the cops. No way has yet been invented to say goodbye to them. And that's classic Chandler. Very sentimental, then he takes the sting off it with those final two lines.
There's a couple mentions of goodbye in that last section there. Where do we get the title, The Long Goodbye? Does that have any relevance to the plot or the material of the novel?
Well, there's The Long Goodbye with Terry Lennox, obviously. He thinks he says goodbye to him because he thinks he's dead in Mexico, having committed suicide, and then it turns out he's not. So he said goodbye once. He says goodbye again. It's a long goodbye. I think there's also the long goodbye of Eileen Wade, who was the wife of him, Terry Lennox, and she had said goodbye to him originally, but then she sees him again, and she can't get back together with him. So that's a very long, protracted goodbye, I should think.
So sometimes his titles are ambiguous. They don't relate to any one particular thing. It might be a 2 or 3 layers of meaning in those titles.
Right.
I believe we saw the same thing in Farewell, My Lovely. You said you're not really sure who that title applies to. It could apply to 2 or 3 different characters or situations.
Right.
I would call these the ambiguous titles. But some of them are less ambiguous. You know, the high window, that has one simple meaning, and we figure it out as we go. And the lady in the lake is not ambiguous. We know what that definitely applies to.
Nor the
But
little sister. But the big sleep, just the title itself is, what does that mean? Yeah. You
yeah,
learn about it at the end in that
yeah,
little Marlowe soliloquy.
yeah.
And then, yeah, this one. And
Do you
yeah.
think it's a good title? Long
Oh,
Goodbye?
yeah, it's a beautiful title. Yeah,
Okay.
I like it very much. But now we can go on to the next thing that I don't like about the novel. And it has to do with this title, The Long Goodbye. The entire 316 pages, I think it was in my version, is a long goodbye to the Philip Marlowe character we have come to know and love.
Good.
There's
Good.
a different persona projected by Marlowe in this one. And again, I can only quote. I went at the start of this video to this letter which accompanied the first draft of the manuscript of The Long Goodbye to Chandler's agents, Brandt and Brandt, and specifically to Bernice Baumgarten. And she and Karl Brandt, they read, this is in 1952, they read the novel immediately. And I'm now citing from a very good, very solid biography of Raymond Chandler. It's by Tom Williams. It's called A Mysterious Something in the Light, The Life of Raymond Chandler. And he cites this letter that Bernice Baumgarten specifically wrote back to Marlowe, May 22nd, 1952. After having read this first draft of The Long Goodbye, she wrote, Karl Brandt, and I were immediately struck by the change in pace in The Long Goodbye. Okay. That's not something I read here, by the way. I picked that up myself, but she affirms it. The advantages are obvious: an opportunity for real characterization, exploration of character, and the psychological reasons for the actions of your characters, and some of your best writing. Indeed. Both of us read it with complete attention. Karl at his single sitting. Our only real concern was the change in Marlowe himself. His hardness was his great virtue, and here he seems to have become almost Christ-like. You put with great understanding his necessarily friendless state, and the great value he sets on having made a friend who wants nothing of him. But still we don't recognize the Marlowe we thought we knew. I can understand his being deeply moved by an unaccustomed friendship, but I can't believe in him as a sentimentalist. We feel that Marlowe would suspect his own softness all the way through and deride it and himself constantly. And I can only agree. And Chandler agreed somewhat as well, because then he wrote back after having received this shattering critique, because he was expecting praise, especially from his agents. Although he asked for criticism, but writers sometimes, please, pull no punches, but then you don't pull a punch, you give him a little jab, it's like, oh! Well, in response to her criticism, he wrote back, I knew the character of Marlowe had changed, and I thought it had to because the hard-boiled stuff was too much of a pose after all this time. Okay, fair enough. but I did not realize that it had become Christ-like and sentimental, and that he ought to be deriding his own emotions. So, in a follow-up letter, then, he says, regarding this criticism of Marlowe, "You are probably, almost certainly, quite right." And then he adds, "My kind of writing demands a certain amount of dash and high spirits. The word is gusto, the quality lacking in modern writing. And you could not know the bitter struggle I have had the past year even to achieve enough cheerfulness to live on, much less to put into a book. So let's face it, I didn't get it into the book. I didn't have it to give." Now, here's where we bring in an autobiographical element. Chandler's wife was 18 years older than him, and she was slowly dying. How's that for another meaning to the title, The Long Goodbye? Of a lung ailment. She finally died, I think it was late 1954. So after the book had been published in 53 in America and 54, or rather it's 53 in Britain and 54 in America. So she lived long enough to see it. But that was really sapping him, taking care of his elderly wife in her final months. That I think we can all relate to and understand. And that's what's also, I think, missing, as he acknowledged. That dash, that gusto, that pace. And that bled over into the character of Philip Marlowe, who has become a sentimentalist and Christ-like. Now, what do you think of that, the Christ-like critique?
Well, for a Christ-like guy, he sure used the GD word quite a bit.
Nor did he ever turn the other cheek.
Right. A little comment from my end about all that you've been saying. My profanity meter was through the roof on this one.
I didn't want to ask, of course. Yeah, it's obvious.
But let me tell you, I got a new meter.
The needle was spinning, right?
Yeah, the needle was spinning there. As he got older and as he got further into the modern age of literature where anything goes, he really laid on the profanity so thick that I thought even you might get tired of it after a while.
Well, you're right. I got the word, I can say it out of context. The word hell, for example, it's overused. Yeah, you're right. I mean, every cop, every gangster,
and the word damn and hell.
Every historical romance author, everyone's using it. It's like, okay, good. Yeah, we understand that people talk that way, but it even got to me a little bit. I agree. Yeah.
Okay, and let me give you a new meter that I've been keeping track of throughout all his novels, and it's relevant here, is what I call the simile meter.
Yes.
How many similes is he putting in here? Now, my simile meter on this one was very low.
Correct.
I keep a running record of what I call great similes and good similes. The great ones are the ones that really hit you and they're really sharp. The good ones are, par for the course kind of simile that any writer would do. Now, in most of these novels, my great similes, there's 2 or 3 dozen of them, and the good similes, there's maybe half of those. But in this one, my great similes are only 6. And my good similes are only 1. In other words,
I agree.
We only have 7 similes that have any real effect. And that's a huge change in the character from the previous novels.
Correct. Yes, you have hit on something very relevant. And this is his longest novel, right?
Right.
The critique, the self-critique of this book, where he says, I just lacked the dash and high spirits I'd brought to previous novels. that applies. That applies to these outlandish similes. Look about as inconspicuous as a tarantula on a slice of angel's wood. That's like, you gotta have some kind of boyish enthusiasm, right? You have some exuberance to come up with that, I would argue, right? You can't just kind of sit there and think that your wife's dying in the next room and you want to make Marlowe more human. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You want the tough talking, shooting from the hip, both literally and figuratively, PI. And another thing that is the problem with this novel for me, and it was the problem I had with The Lady in the Lake, and you know what's coming. He's not in the thick of LA proper, where he belongs. This just reaffirmed for me that he belongs in LA. Marlowe, LA proper, they're two peas in a pod. And to extend that little metaphor, I did excerpt something that Marlowe himself says about being in Idle Valley. He spends at least half the book in Idle Valley, wherever this is, right?
But could it be Idlewild?
That's no. Where is Idlewild? I don't know.
I think it's in the San Bernardino Mountains, so that wouldn't
No,
be.
no. He's in the other direction, man. Okay, anyway. But Marlowe himself says it. Chandler puts this sentence in his mouth, and it is a very damning sentence, I would say, for this whole project of making Marlowe more touchy-feely, moving him out of LA, slowing down the action. This says it all. I excerpted it. Marlowe himself says, "I belonged in Idle Valley like a pearl onion on a banana split." That's a pretty good one. I don't know if that made it into your half dozen, but that's how I felt. He really doesn't belong here. This is not his milieu. These upper class suburbanites getting drunk every night and hitting on each other's wives. That's not his scene. No. He's out there mixing it up with the tough boys and, grabbing a kiss here and there from a beautiful femme fatale. That's his thing, right? And so I have to say, I was a little bit disappointed in that. I didn't think I'd say that about any of these novels, including Playback, our last, which I have been arguing the whole time is his weakest, because his powers are really waning at that point, because I know what to expect in Playback, and you get a lot of cool prose and similes there. But this really did disappoint me. And also symptomatic of how I felt about this novel the entire time I was reading it is that my favorite chapter, in fact, is chapter 21. And this is the chapter where we get a day in the life of an LA PI. Remember that?
Yeah.
And when that comes about at page 100, right? And when we came to that, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm back home. Here we are. Here's the Marlowe I recognize, right? Wisecracking across the desk with recalcitrant clients and would-be clients, doing the work, showing us the footwork, how you do it, to find a missing person. That's always interesting in these Marlowe novels. How exactly do you go about, doing a job as a PI in a certain situation? And we get about 5 priceless pages of that. And I'm thinking, oh man, that's it. That just tells the whole story, along with this line, "I belonged in Idle Valley like a pearl onion on a banana split." This chapter that I just, embraced, that told the whole story, that this is what I'm longing for, and I'm not getting it in this novel. So.
Okay.
And did you feel the same way?
I found the novel a bit tedious.
Right.
And I agree with you. The opening third of it was somewhat easy to understand because he's really focusing on only 1 or 2 characters, not a whole slew of them suddenly intermingling, and you're trying to figure out who's who and who's doing what. Focusing on Terry Lennox and that friendship, it helped to kind of ground it in something that I could follow easily. But then it started getting a little bit of the convoluted stuff after that, and it did become a bit tedious. And it was his longest novel, so I was thinking of The Long Goodbye as the long novel. You know, it's the long one among his others.
Yeah. And if he did say, and I'm sure he did, that this is his best novel at some point in a letter or wherever, it again is the author trying to write a novel, capital N, right? Because he had sort of been under an inferiority complex. I mean, he was a very confident man, and he felt that he was writing the best prose in America today, I think he even said, which I would argue is, could have well been the case. But because Hemingway's powers were declining at that point in the 40s. And he felt that he was treated as a second-class citizen as a writer of detective novels, of mystery novels. So I think that's part of the motivation he had to try and go beyond the boundaries of the detective novel. Okay, noble effort, great. But as he writes in a letter, it doesn't mean the reader has to follow you. And neither you nor I did. So.
Yeah, it may well be my least favorite of the ones we've read as well.
Mm-hmm. What's also disappointing, and you may share my disappointment, is he finally goes to bed with a woman, you know?
Oh, well, you know, as you know, I'm somewhat puritanical about those things, but you don't seem to mind that too much usually. Why would it be objectionable here?
Because it's like the friendship he has with Terry Lennox and how he involves himself in all these various lives. He's supposed to be the cool, distanced observer. He's not supposed to entangle himself in any way, shape, or form. Now, we imagine a guy like Marlowe, he has girlfriends, right? He goes to bed with them, but we don't want it trotted out for us.
I do appreciate the way he didn't graphically describe any sexual intercourse there. He kind of just.
No, he doesn't do that. But I mean, yeah, he doesn't do that. But again, it's all part of this weakening of the hard-boiled Marlowe character. Because Marlowe is the first-person narrator. He's telling us. He now volunteers the information that he went to bed with this woman. It's like, come on, Phil. The Philip Marlowe I knew from Fairmont and Lovely would never have volunteered that information.
And she even asked him to marry her after that.
Yeah, but even Marlowe says that she didn't mean it. You know, she wasn't serious.
And he said if we did get married, we'd be broken up in 6 months.
Right. That's another story. It comes into play in playback at the end. You'll see. We won't spoil it for listeners or potential readers of the novel, but no, I'm not puritanical at all, as you know. But I didn't care for that for the reasons I tried to enumerate.
Interesting.
He's the cool, distanced, hard guy who gets involved in people's lives to the extent that it's his job. And he is maybe a sentimentalist at heart, but he ain't going to admit it. Here he's admitting it all over the place.
Yeah.
He's wearing his heart on his sleeve. That's not the character I have grown to appreciate and even hold on a pedestal as one of the great fictional creations of American literature, Philip Marlowe. That's not the Philip Marlowe I'm talking about, not the Philip Marlowe we have in The Long Goodbye.
So is your critique essentially that Philip Marlowe has gone soft?
Yes. That's it. Thank you for boiling it down to that one sentence.
Okay.
Yes, I think so. So I've said this in past videos. This isn't me just all of a sudden ganging up on Chandler or his characterization of Marlowe here. I've said this in the past. And it's what Bernice Baumgarten said in her letter, in fact, that the great virtue of Marlowe is his hardness, right? Hardness in and of itself is not perhaps a virtue, particularly when it's put to evil ends. But Marlowe's a good guy. And he's putting his toughness to obviously very good ends and making a couple bucks in the process, but he's a poor man. He's not in this business to make money. And, you know, a guy who has a soft heart like that, insofar, yes, the term soft we can use, but is a real tough hombre, that's an interesting combination. But when he goes soft on the outside a little bit, okay, let's not exaggerate, right? He's still, he's no blushing violet. You know, he can still hold his own. But when he starts to go soft on the outside, even if it's just a little bit, it taints the image that I cherish of him.
Okay, Kev, you gave us a nice summary of the novel and your opinions thereof. And I share much, if not all, of what you're saying. This next week, apparently, we're taking a break, right?
Yeah, my own book, LA Kid, has come out in Europe. And I'm going on a little reading tour.
And we'll be back in 2 weeks then, Saturday?
2 weeks of playback. His final effort, Raymond Chandler's final effort, his swan song. And yeah, should also be not uninteresting.
Okay, so we'll be back in 2 weeks. We've only got about 4 or 5 minutes left here. Is there any final things to say about The Long Goodbye?
No, except just to reemphasize that everything that I have said and that you have said or have concurred with me on is what the fancy academic types love about the novel. Oh, he's sensitive. Oh, it's a slower paced matter. Oh, we're exploring character more. Maybe they even say, oh, he doesn't beat those similes to death. I don't know. But all the reasons we don't necessarily care for this, at least in comparison to the others, the academic crowd, they just turn backflips over it, which is predictable.
Okay. I guess that's about it, Kev.
All right.
Thanks for your input and your point of view, and we'll be back in 2 weeks.
Okay, Tim. See you later.
Good luck on your book tour.
Thanks very much. See you.
All right. Bye-bye now.